Welcome back to Quality of Life in the Global Environment, Preparing for the Next Century. I want to inform some of you out there, we've already received several questions, and I'd like to have the people here in the live audience know that we would invite you to come to this microphone if you have a question of the panelists or of any of us and related to their presentations. Let me, before we get the discussion going again, I'd like to remind you that if you have questions, you can send them on the 800 number 222-9703. And if you want to use the email, we can pick those up as well at choices@vt.edu. So we'll welcome your responses and those of you from the live audience as well. Now, we won't go to a question immediately because there's a bunch of rambunctious people up here on the panel that want to talk to each other a little bit. And I'm going to invite Eugene to comment on what other panelists have said and how it affects your understanding of the issues.
Well, I was intrigued by Mr. Sagoff's presentation, and I agree that I think there will be a transition in energy to different sources of energy in the coming decades. The question is what will drive it. But that's a rather profound transition. It's an installed base committed to fossil fuels and the way we drive of trillions of dollars. Do you think that this transition can occur smoothly without any upheaval? Or do you think it's going to involve a lot of economic dislocation, et cetera?
I think it will involve a lot of hybridization. You'll see automobiles with fuel cells. You'll see a transition slowly, stepwise, to a hydrogen economy. That is, we will try to limit the amount of carbon in the fuel mix and increase the amount of hydrogen. It's not carbon that we burn, it's carbon that goes off, but it's really the hydrogen that makes the fuel valuable to us. So as we will, I hope, move toward a greater hydrogen mix in the fuel, as we do from coal to natural gas. The electrical industry that has not seen a lot of dislocation because it's burning much more gas, which is much richer in hydrogen, than coal, which is far more polluting. I look forward to seeing this change throughout until we produce electricity primarily through burning hydrogen that we would presumably obtain through renewable sources.
Can I follow up on that
just
briefly?
Sure, Alan has a comment too, I think.
The one reason we're not seeing this transition is that the keepers of this installed base are not willingly stepping aside.
Oh, yes.
And as I understand it, we're going through a cycle right now of a bunch of old electrical generating capacity being put aside and new capacity coming in because natural gas is so cheap. We're basically committing to the next 30 years still in a fossil fuel cycle. And the question is if they're not willing to step aside now and voluntarily, what's going to happen in the future that is going to make them more open to...
Well, let me give a suggestion.
Yeah.
And this is perhaps a little radical, but let's just look at the pattern of how we provide incentives in our society through our tax system, right? Essentially, we're using a system that was put in place roughly 100 years ago. We subsidize use of natural resources, including fossil fuels, and we tax the employment, right? Employers and ourselves have to pay Social Security taxes. They're basically an employment tax. But our problem is to use less natural resources, so we create less pollution, and to create more jobs. So suppose we switch those taxes. We gradually phased out the tax on employment and phased in a tax on natural resource use and just changed those incentives. If we did that over a 10 or 15-year period, then in fact there wouldn't be too much dislocation, and particularly if everybody knew it was going to come in, every January 1st the tax went up and the other tax went down, because then corporations and private citizens can plan for such a transition and make their own decisions about when the price signals make sense to them to switch. But the fact is we don't really have a social interest anymore in subsidizing natural resource use, and we certainly have a social incentive to increase employment and jobs. And not just in this country, but the problem's even worse in Europe and other places. So I think that part of the problem is that we're still running under a set of sort of price and incentive signals that were put in place under conditions a century ago that were very different. And such a tax shift like this is, I think, the only mechanism to have a gradual but effective transition over a period of a couple decades.
Let me take this opportunity just to ask a question of the panel. If we went to Eugene's proposition that the future, and then the foreseeable future is going to be much more unstable, would most of you agree with that proposition? I'm not asking for detailed questions so much, but is your feeling that Eugene is saying that that the forces that are at work, climatic change and economic and social changes that are associated with it, are likely to make the future more troubling than the one we now have, even though he sees that as remarkably stable?
Well, I would just comment on that, that I think it is regional specific whether or not we've had stability for the last 150 years. If you were in Cambodia, or if you were in the Sahara with desertification, or if you were in Haiti or wherever, it has not been a stable time.
Well, I would agree with that, but I don't think stability has to be ubiquitous for it to be a stable era. I'm talking about big phenomenon like global depressions and great power conflict and global climatic upheaval, that sort of thing, and we haven't had that. And I think it's reflected in this extraordinary period of prosperity and economic growth around the world that's been going on.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, I took your comments as referring to, in fact, global and large-scale kinds of cycles, but at the same time, it occurred to me that this is a paradox. This is a comment on what you were saying. The paradox is that even in spite of these large-scale time periods of global stability, and I'm convinced that your case is well made, my sense is that the experience that individuals have had has been an experience of increasing instability. I mean, people talk about, in fact, the halcyon years of 40 years ago and transformations. I think we've all had this experience of, in fact, unsettling instability in our personal lives, in our personal experiential kind of milieu that is a paradox when set up against that.
Yeah, I think that it's the values that are or stable or unstable. We worry about the family values in the 1950s. We worry about political participation. We worry about civil society. We worry about our human relations, social relations to one another, our responsibility for others. Whether we can keep hold of traditional moral values when there's so much technological change. One thinks of abortion, all of the strange things with biotechnology and reproduction. That's going to be a big test, and I certainly don't know whether we'll pass it.
I would argue that if times are more unstable, values tend to be, particularly family and community values, tend to become more important as people take out insurance of various types, and so you'll see a resurgence of the nuclear family and the kinship group of one sort or another, and that could be a good byproduct of instability. I think the other thing I'd like to say is, Al Hammond showed that map of land scarcity. Egypt was the only country today in 1990. And what happens if you have an unstable situation where scarcities of various sorts are driving policy? What happens often is that you can see what you have to do, but you just can't do it. They would love to increase the price of grain, for instance, in Egypt in order to give farmers better incomes so they could improve their agricultural techniques. They really can't do that because you've got a resurgence of Islamic fundamentalism in the cities, and they feed off the kind of the impact of a price of bread being the basic staple of life in the cities. Any price rise tends to produce riots. So they get caught in a bind where you actually can see what you have to do. It's not that you all of a sudden in unstable times you don't know what you have. It's just you can't apply the technologies that would make life better, and you get caught in a vicious loop.
Yeah, I think that that it is a tendency to think sort of about our own society too much, perhaps. And I'm not sure that we really have had or are presently living in a particularly stable period if you really look carefully. For example, we think about the rapid economic growth in China and Indonesia and places like that, but in fact, in nearly 70 countries, per capita incomes have dropped over the last 20 years. And in those places, life has gotten much more difficult and much worse. And in fact, those are precisely the places where population growth is most rapid as well, because it's in fact rational, if you're very poor, to have a lot of kids. certainly economically rational. So I think that we're bifurcating between a industrial global economy and culture, which is fairly stable in that sense, and a second part of the world which is increasingly nasty, brutish, insecure, and where life is rather short. And that is, I think, a fundamental kind of instability for the future.
Well, I
but
agree.
both
Leading indicator.
I'd like to comment on one part of scarcity, is that, for example, in many parts of the world, there's been recent redistribution of land and the giving out of land titles. Often women are not included in that redistribution. And one argument is that, oh, it's too scarce. What would we do if all of a sudden all the women too wanted titles? So I think there is that kind, when scarcity comes about, then you find people being marginalized so that the resources can come to a particular group.
Let me be an advocate for our watchers and audience here. I have a question from New Rochelle, New York, and in fact it's directed to you, Mary. It says, and I quote, "How much evidence is there to demonstrate that educating women and ensuring social equality actually produces environmental benefits? Does this have an effect on population growth?"
All right, well, the first thing is there's a direct correlation that we know now, especially it was highlighted in Cairo on the Population and Development Conference, of a direct correlation between more education for women and those women will have fewer and fewer children. So that correlation has been proven now time and time again. The World Bank has come out and said that probably the greatest thing we can do for environmental degradation is to improve the education of women. Often in many countries of the world, the literacy rate for women is far below that of men. Increasingly, the countries, at least where I work in sub-Saharan Africa, are rectifying this. They have recognized the fact that women and girls must attend school, and they have policies that help that. So I guess that really is my position on it as well. The more women are included in training on how to manage natural resources, for example, the more women have access to credit, the more women are professionals in the area of natural resource management or environmental concerns and issues, obviously the better it is for the environment as a whole.
I'd like to invite the others to join this conversation, but if you say there's a correlation, in other words, if I had $100 and I spent $50 of it, let's say in a third world country, to educate women, let's say to increase their literacy, that would increase the chances that the environment would improve.
That's right. That's what the World Bank says. Lawrence Summers, who was the chief economist at the World Bank, was the first one to make the proposition that the investment in women's education is probably the greatest investment we can make in international development.
But I think the point of view that he's taking is that the payoff is in reduction in fertility. It seems to me that the direct involvement or the direct connection between educating a particular woman and an implication for the environment is rather remote. I thought you had a better example, actually, Mary, when you referred to the CHIPCO movement, where empowered women who may or may not be educated, in fact, are engaged in real, direct environmental interventions.
Yes, there's, yeah, sure.
Well, it also, I wonder, if I can say it aloud, about the whole premise of the demographic transition. Around the world right now,
what do you mean exactly by the demographic?
Well, the notion that as societies develop, birth rates fall and population will come down. Therefore, you need it's lawful that you need development before birth rates come down. Well, that's not the case. Okay. And I think around the world you see birth rates dropping. One reason is urban migration, where it just gets more expensive to have a kid in a city, and quite often you're worse off in the city these days than you were out in the countryside.
Certainly in Bangladesh, that's for sure.
And so, I mean, that was one. And then you see birth rates dropping. Virginia Abernathy down the road here, I think, argues that when people see the future as bleak, they take action to limit family size regardless of how educated they are. And in essence, you see that in Russia today. We're a very unstable society and in the process of a demographic collapse.
Yeah. But you also have the argument that was in the Scientific American of Dasgupta, who was arguing that the increased poverty you'll have increased population growth because of the adage of increased need for labor.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, those sort of crude models of, speaking as a demographer, I do demography, those crude models of demographic transition have been, among professional demographers, routed.
But it's still enshrined in
it's enshrined in policy, and this is the interesting thing. Exactly, it's exactly right.
But you two agree with each other then that the idea that there's more or less a natural demographic transition if you increase the economy is not likely to
actually
occur.
It's it's let 1,000 flowers bloom, because it's a different story in every place. Right. And one reason the whole model fell is that every different locale had a different story. Some places have preceded,
in fact,
some
one
places
of the
have
really
followed.
hopeful trends is that if you really look at the use of contraception in developing societies, it has gone very rapidly in the last 3 and 4 decades. It's just an enormous change in the number of couples using some form of contraception in rich and poor societies alike. Yeah. So that is, in fact, one of the things that gives people some hope that we might stabilize our population globally in the next half century.
One last point on that?
Please,
which is the difference between what happened in Rio and what happened in Cairo. Rio, there was one sentence in the agenda on population, and that was argued over endlessly. By Cairo, you saw, I had mullahs from Iran coming up and bragging about their population control programs, and the Egyptians were trucking me all over the place. And their programs were far more coercive than anything called for in the Cairo Declaration. And so you had this enormous shift in just a couple of years, and a shift that I think is ongoing.
Assuming for a second that they didn't, that the attitudes they took at Rio maybe were somehow political rather than what they really believed, that they were being targeted, or that somehow the Western world arguably is consuming too much and we're putting all the burden on them for having too many people. Or how else would you explain such a rapid change in deeply held beliefs by Islams and Catholics too? I think there was a change in the...
I think that that's actually one of the things that is fascinating, because some of these changes we pointed to, the use of energy patterns, so on, take a very long time to change. But social attitudes and perceptions can change very rapidly, and that is our greatest source of hope. And I'll give you an example. Think back to the attitudes towards smoking in this country just 10 years ago, and compare it with today, where it's socially unacceptable, in effect, to smoke in an auditorium such as this, right? And who would have predicted that? The same thing happened in the Soviet Union, right? In a sense, a whole nation lost faith in its system of governance, and it collapsed, unpredicted, within 5 years. So I think that if people decide that the future that they see coming at them isn't the one they want, and we collectively change our attitudes like that, then we, in fact, can change that. Trends are not destiny. And that is, in fact, the greatest source of hope. It has to start, in individual groups and small villages and small groups of citizens, but collectively, that is what can change rapidly. And that is, in fact, the power to alter our futures in a fundamental way.
Very good. Well, I'd like to, there are several questions here. This one is directed to you, Alan. It said, you said agricultural production must be, quote, modernized, end of quote, in order to meet population needs by 2050. Like Does this mean more consolidation into big agribusiness?
Well, let's put it this way. That's what happened in this country. A century ago, 30% of our workforce was directly involved in agriculture. Now less than 3% are. Why should we expect it to be different in sub-Saharan Africa or in China or in India? And it is, in fact, that change, which is, in fact, traumatic to individual farmers and so on, but it is also what helps yields to rise. And in particularly the countries that showed up on that map as having potential land and water scarcity, they have a choice. They either modernize, or people starve, or people leave and go someplace else. So that's really the choice. And I think the question is, which is in fact going to happen? I don't know what will happen, but I know those pressures are going to grow.
Does everyone tend to agree with that?
I think that the pressures are toward that happening, and I certainly agree with Al that this is the transformation that occurred in this country in the past, and it's one that's being motivated by a good deal of forces, including conscious development decisions in other countries. It's precisely the kind of thing that I'd hope to speak about and perhaps criticize a bit, because the transformations that are occurring are not necessarily good. I find them, yes, apparently they're associated with higher yields. I wonder if there are other ways to have higher yields that aren't so damaging to sort of the human ecology of the process.
One can hope that other societies will learn from what we didn't do very well, right? I mean, we did very destructive kinds of agriculture, and we had dust bowls and things like that, and we've gradually learned, and we now have erosion set-aside programs and so on. We had lots of pollution and silent springs and so on, and we've gradually learned. But other people, as they go through that developmental thing, might decide and might have the capability to avoid some of the worst of those problems.
And what's interesting is that even in this country, where obviously this process has been most accelerated, I mean, I'm really taken and interested in some of the movements represented by people like Wes Jackson at the Land Institute and Wendell Berry. It seems to me that they are exploring new possibilities that don't have to result in the kinds of dislocation that certainly our population has suffered.
Mark, you've been waiting to get in. Can I make a plug for our audience for a minute, and then you go ahead. Again, I'd like to remind the people here, please come to the microphone if you'd like to ask a question or engage one of these people in an argument. For those of you out there, again, if you want to call, it's 1-800-222-9703. I now have a fax number as well, which is 800-231-2675. Excuse me, Mark, go ahead.
Well, part of the problem is just getting civil order. In Somalia, the farmers had no trouble feeding that population as soon as they weren't going to be shot when they were on the land or their goods not stolen. Angola is one of the most fertile countries one can think of, but it's hardly producing because there's been a civil war as long as one can remember. The Ukraine suffers much more from civil instability than from bad weather, and I guess the Ukraine might be the most fertile place in the world. So we would not only look for technological innovation, but for civil order. Right. And when there's civil order, there can also be trade. And if some of the nations of the world where there is real land scarcity and where there are impoverished resources could produce something that people would want to pay for, they would be in a position to buy grain from areas of the world like Kansas that actually produce much more than the Kansans could possibly consume.
Yes, sir.
I guess it's working. As we hold this conference, legislators in about 10 states, including Virginia, have debated or are debating using hemp industrially for fiber and oil and other means. And I'd like to have one or two people to comment on what they think about the hemp movement. And it is a growing industry, by the way, but it's all imported, partly from Canada.
Okay, who wants to wrestle with it first? Well, let me take a shot. Well, I think I've been a little bit involved with that because the institute that I had has been having some negotiations among tobacco growers in the southern states, the tobacco growing states, and with what we call health advocates, who are people who generally think smoking is bad for you. And we were trying to find some way to diversify the rural life and the economics of farming so as to reduce the dependence of these rural communities on continued consumption and use of tobacco and cigarettes. And so this hemp thing has become quite a big topic, and I'll just put it after this. I think that I understand it, that the kind of hemp that some people are promoting for all kinds of uses, lubrication, textiles, even beer, I understand, lacks the psychoactive agent that we tend to find in the stuff that some people smoke or use for other ways. Is that your sense of it?
Oh, yeah, of course. And one thing I wanted to add is that the largest farmers organization in Virginia, the Virginia Farm Bureau, were instrumental in getting the bill before the Virginia General Assembly. It's 123,000 farmers who want to grow hemp.
Thank you for your comment.
I just wanted to add that it's kind of funny that you mentioned it. One of the slides that I showed, those two fellows that I opened up with, the clothing that they were wearing, apart from the wool, was actually made of hemp. I mean, hemp is a fiber, or it's used for fibers of various sorts, and the oil, et cetera, is used as well. And I asked them, do you smoke it, when I was there, and they said, no, it makes you crazy.
Yes, ma'am.
Historically, world countries have exploited third world countries, and should we contribute, and if so, how much should we contribute to get them back on their feet?
Well, I'll take a shot at that.
Why don't you repeat the question for the audience?
The question was, should we be contributing to help some of the poorest countries get back on their feet, and if so, how much? And I guess my question is to ask, in what form or what do we mean by contribute? There's been a pattern of giving grants and loans to governments who then, in theory, spend that money to help their countries. And that hasn't worked very well. That's sort of top-down. It's led to a lot of corruption and a lot of big projects that didn't, in fact, work very well. I think it's maybe time to think about another pattern in which we provide resources directly to people and to individual communities, not gifts, but tools, including credit and things like that, that allow them to make their own futures better. And I think that pattern of how we help other people needs to change and needs to be more of a dialogue, not a we're giving you something so you can be better kind of attitude. So I think part of the problem has been, so my answer is yes, we do need, we really have a stake in how our neighbors live. It's a small planet. But we need to think carefully about how the best way to help other people really is.
I've been working recently with a model that is modeled really after foundations, where a country, say Kenya, and another country, say Finland, get together, set up a foundation where both of them serve in a supervisory and policy board at the top of this foundation, have this money available, and then is given to those people at the local level who are proposed there and develop proposals for it. I think that's a very hopeful model too.
Yeah.
Anybody else wish to comment?
Well, I just, some years back, I wrote a book called The Alms Race about this very question of the impact of aid. And my thesis at the end of this book was that aid did more to help the the donors than the beneficiaries, and that's why we kept repeating the same dumb project year in, year out. And
It wasn't really dumb, it was profitable.
Well, it was profitable. A couple of $1 billion over the years to Mobutu did not bring about any noticeable change in Zaire. And I wholeheartedly second what Al was saying about microcredit and this model, this paradigm pioneered by Mohammed Yunus, and of just giving very small loans, and even the World Bank's behind it now, to women largely throughout the world so they can get on their feet.
I'm going to get with you two in just a moment. There's a question here from Ames, Iowa, and it goes, again, it's addressed to you, Mary. It's kind of, I think, consistent with this relationship between the social system and the natural system, or moral system. It says, and I quote now, regarding the social significance of zebu cattle, will hybridizing the cattle to get more milk, and then he has in parentheses, zebu are not good milk producers,
That's right.
be in conflict with any religious beliefs about the sacredness of zebu? Will the need for more milk override traditional significance of the zebu?
Well, exactly. I think those are some of the issues that have come up during this project. What has happened, however, is that the crossbred cows, often crossed with zebu, often brought in as jerseys or whatever, have in fact been good producers, good income earners for the people, and there has been tremendous impact from them. The way we know that is, for example, 100 cows are introduced as demonstration cows, but yet there have been 400 other people who have gotten their savings together to get the cow also to have zero grazing. So I think there's always that, that possibility that in fact, you know, that there will be a clash perhaps between the zebu owners and those with crossbred cows. However, that was not an issue while we were there.
Thank you.
Really.
Oh, ma'am, you may go ahead.
Good afternoon. I'm involved with an organization, an international non-governmental organization called the First Millennial Foundation, whose ultimate goal is to help humanity get a permanent presence in outer space in terms of colonies and so on. And in the near term, what they're working on is trying to get colonies going in the oceans of the world using the resources native to those areas, such as the deep water ocean water, which is cold and full of minerals and can be used to generate electricity through turning a turbine with the hot water at the surface in the equatorial oceans, and using the vast amount of nutrients in this deep ocean water to grow vast amounts of food that could help allay starvation around the world. And they're also getting involved in the growing eco-village movement of small-scale communities all around the world who are trying to become ecologically sustainable. And I wanted to ask the panel here to reflect on those trends and about eco-villages and using ocean resources that are currently being untapped.
Well, I think I tend to be very dubious about ideas of establishing colonies either in outer space or the bottom of the ocean, for the simple reason I think people get...
Pardon me?
Or even at the water world type thing. But I mean, people get lonely. And they also, I mean, they tend to miss, you know, whatever environment they grew up in. This E.O. Wilson notion of biophilia, you know, that there is a certain relationship to the environment that needs to be sustained. And so I don't see us happily colonizing the moon or something as the Japanese. I read the other day in the journal or someplace that some guys busily pulverizing clay to sort of recreate moon rock so he can build a condo on the moon someday. I think it's a bad business venture in that case. As for the notions of tapping the oceans, again, a lot of ideas come along, and I think there's a book called When Things Bite Back about the unanticipated side effects of technology. Most of these ideas have unanticipated side effects. The salmon population, wild salmon population, may be jeopardized by salmon farming, for instance. Drift nets were invented by I think the FAO as a way of getting the Japanese fisheries back on their feet after World War II, and ended up basically the scourge of the ocean, driving a whole lot of species out. I think we have to, my tendency is to think we have to sort of solve our problems with the tools we have, and that as close to home and as close to familiar things as we have, because of this notion of unanticipated side effects. And so I tend to be dubious of this thing.
Yeah, Mark and then Bill.
We have to also remember that the way to feed people who are starving is to give them the money to buy food. If you were able to produce food more cheaply this way, it would not go to those people. What would happen is the same people who are buying food now would buy that food, and you'd get a little less production in Iowa. So the way to relieve famine is to improve the economic status of those who are starving.
I was going to make essentially the same point, that producing more food isn't our problem. We know how to produce plenty of food. We know how to produce twice as much food as we do now globally. The problem is the people who can't afford to buy it. That's the problem.
Thank you for your question. And the question of eco-villages, and some of that may come up again in later parts of the panel discussion.
Could I just,
sure.
Since we sort of ended on a negative note about that particular suggestion, I kind of like to think of it as exploring one of a very wide range of possibilities, and I hope that none of you were saying that we should we should abolish any attempt at this, because I think that these kinds of creative and interesting, and to some people's point of view slightly whacked solutions are in fact a part of a bank of ideas of possibility, and they're very important. It's likely that ocean villages in particular, as a massive enterprise, will never be a major solution, but I think that it's very interesting to have these things on the margin.
I have another angle on that. I'd like to be interested in your reaction. Isn't, in a sense, going to another planet or even to the ocean, in other words, to expand, in other words, not to accept any kind of limits that are kind of available to us now in a way. Isn't it kind of a conventional notion that we can escape some way the limits that we're facing? And isn't this kind of the typical mechanism? And
well, I think it's, yeah, exactly. That we screw up this planet, we'll find a new one. And very serious people have proposed this, that ultimately, well, if things get too bad, human ingenuity will get us somewhere else. And it's a way of sort of, I think it is literally an escape. I mean, in every respect.
Okay. But we'll put it in the bank of ideas.
For sure.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry, because the lights from my eyes, I can't quite always see. I noticed that this was a gentleman. I referred to him as a lady.
This is a gentleman.
My question is for Mr. Sargoff on the end. If all of our predictions are so inaccurate, how can we plan for the future?
Well, I'm glad you asked. You can just take my word for it. I think that we have to go, this may seem like a corny answer, but we were talking about production of grain earlier, and I can produce some corn right here. There are values at stake here, and it isn't just a matter of producing more and more goods and services for which people are willing to pay. It's a matter of our organizing ourselves politically and democratically so that we can consider what we are doing together, so we do not have to act simply on our own personal interest. And when we do that, we'll be looking for ways to achieve certain goals: the protection of nature, the establishment and flourishing of families, the bringing of more of the world's poor into the global economy. These moral goals are the only goals we can truly say are ours in a time of great uncertainty about technology. So I think we have to be guided by some pretty fundamental moral values rather than by any kind of economic theory or faith in technology or pessimism about technology. We should do the best we can where this notion of best has basically a moral foundation.
Let me push this a little bit further. I hope this is consistent with your question. What about those who say we spend too much time trying to forecast the future rather than to invent it and bring ways of making it come true?
Yeah. I think that's really not the case. I mean, there's not very significant activity spent thinking about the future. In fact, I would argue that most of us don't think about the future. We tend to look backwards. We think about how we grew up, and maybe we think a little bit about now or what we're going to do in a month or two, but we don't think about the future. And for most of human habitation on the Earth, that's been fine. But we have now reached a scale of human activity that does have long-term and global consequences. So it might behoove us to spend a little bit more time thinking about the future. The image that I've used sometimes is it's like this. We're driving now very rapidly into the future in a vehicle. In fact, we're driving over uncertain terrain, as we've all described, without any headlights. Right? So maybe we ought to fashion a few headlights so we can at least peer dimly into the future and hope we can see the cliff before we drive off it. Right?
I'd like to add something to that. I agree. I think, I mean, one reason I undertook my project was that it seemed to me that the forces that are going to shape life in the next century are barely on the policy agenda. And that we're thinking about taxes and we're thinking about near-term legislative things, gun control, all that sort of stuff. And really, I mean, the fact that, as Al pointed out, human population has grown by a factor of 6 in this century, and we've become a geophysical force, you know, it just gets into the news only at the edge of consciousness and not at all under the policy agenda. And yet these are the things that are going to be determining how we live in the coming decades.
No, I think I agree with that. I think that the kind of in-basket syndrome, that whatever comes in first gets dealt with in the longer range questions, and trying to think about what we're going to do next month when we can't get the bills paid for this week is a phenomenon that politicians and corporate leaders, I'm sure, as well experience. But I thought this point of this question was, since Mark seemed to put down the ability to predict in his remarks, then what faith can we have in looking ahead? And my question to Mark was more directed to the fact that if you know what you want, or if you have, like your values, Mark, you seem to, without specifying them particularly, it is, I think you feel that we know what people think is morally right, or if they thought about it, they would say this is the kind of future we want, and if the trends are moving in this direction, then we need to devise, in a sense, an alternative future, and thus the idea of inventing rather than forecasting. That's how I meant it in any case.
And there's one other thing I think one can say about that. We undertook a project where we asked people all over the world what kind of world they would like for their grandchildren. And what came back was quite specific to each culture or each society in terms of the examples they use. But if you look at what the values, what the sort of goals they were not too dissimilar all around the world, and they were very similar to what Mark said. People would like there not to be poverty, they'd like their grandchildren to have opportunities, they'd like there to be peace, they'd like to have freedom from fear and violence and famine and so on. I mean, these are not alien or strange or far out kind of goals that in some sense most people share. So it's very easy, and the thing is we don't stop to look and say, well, are we headed toward that future or not? And furthermore, even when some people do, they sort of say, well, I can't do anything about it, you know, forget it. And I think that that's precisely what's wrong, because we can do something about it, but we have to do it together.
I liked your metaphor, Al, with the vehicle and the whole thing. And my first response was, well, what kind of vehicle is it? You know, would you rather have a Pathfinder or a Corvair or something? And yeah. I thought, well, and then, you know, I'm facetious at first, and I thought I had to make this serious, that in looking toward the future and driving that vehicle, you want the all-terrain vehicle because you want the flexibility of, in fact, taking advantage of new information, new realizations as you go along.
Let me give our television audience a question here. This is from the Environmental Studies program up at Providence College in Providence, Rhode Island. I quote it now. There was a New York Times Magazine article, March 3rd, about Africa, which stated that social and political disruption were a major cause of environmental degradation and disease. Eugene Linden seemed to make the reverse point. We would like to know the other panelists' opinions on this matter, but let's give Eugene the first shot to say, is that an accurate statement, do you believe? That
I'd say both feed into the other in a closed loop. In other words, if you have environmental degradation, you can have migration and other destabilizing factors where it becomes more difficult to apply human ingenuity. And if you have civil unrest because of ethnic reasons or something like that, as you've seen in the Rwandan refugees in Zaire, you can have environmental degradation, and then you can have, in turn, more civil unrest. So it's a closed loop sort of thing. It's not a simple cause. It's not you know, I think both are factors, but I think what we've neglected in the past is the role in which environmental degradation, population pressures, and other scarcities play in causing unrest.
Right. And if you remember those maps I threw up, in fact, we haven't got to the acute level in most societies where these sort of land and water scarcities are really crowding people to the limits. But I think it's not incidental that Rwanda is the most land-short country in Africa, in fact, in the world, that depends almost entirely on agriculture. And so is it any surprise that that's a country in which tensions between different ethnic groups over land and things like that came to a boil?
It has one of the highest birth rates in Africa, population growth rates in Africa.
And my point is that if population growth continues, which is partly to say if those societies stay poor, so that that's one of the incentives for them to continue, and if women don't have access to birth control methods and things like that, then those curves and those maps will apply, which is to say, whereas we have very few countries that are under those kind of stresses now, and we're seeing a few countries dissolve, right, and those societies come apart. We're now, but if you look 50 years into the future, we're looking at countries that contain between 1/3 and 1/2 of the world's population being under those same stresses. And that is a scary proposition from anybody's point of view, and at a humanitarian level, it's an appalling prospect.
Right. Well, you know, last night, excuse me, I don't know who I interrupted there, but last night in our discussions at dinner and afterwards, there was some question about whether affluence is not part of the problem as well as poverty. And I guess in all the depictions that we had here and in the comments, it was almost always related to the third world rather than to the United States or the first world as a cause of environmental destruction. What is your attitude about the role of affluence? I know that Paul Ehrlich, who may not be Mark's favorite philosopher or biologist, had said that the impact on the environment and resources is a function of population, affluence, and the kinds of technology associated with that affluence. So does that make sense?
No, I'd like to take a brief crack at that. And one of my premises is that one of the transitions that has to happen, just as we probably will go to alternative fuels, is something has to succeed the consumer society. And because I think the consumer society is unsustainable. It is very, very difficult to imagine a society without growth, or to imagine a consumer society with stable population, for instance. You need new markets, you need new sources, and where's that growth going to come from once you achieve that kind of sustainability? And that's one of the major transitions, I think, that has to happen. So I would argue that not so much affluence, but the sort of innate sort of way of looking at the world that's embedded in the consumer society is really one of the roots of the problem.
But Mark, go ahead, too.
I don't think that affluence is the best term. Actually,
use that term. I don't think
if somebody uses, if Mr. Bill Gates uses his $10 billion to contribute to the Nature Conservancy, and we therefore preserve, thousands of square miles of rainforest or whatever, I mean, that's not a use of affluence. That's plainly bad. So, wealth produces the power to change the world for good or for bad, and I think that's all we can say. But a different matter is the consumer society. The kind of individualism of I want to get mine. It's actually the broad middle class or even the lower middle class that probably has more to do with consumption than the very rich who historically, in the old Calvinist way, produce and produce and produce, but may not actually themselves consume that much. We want to change from a society that's driven by individualistic concerns of the consumer to a more community-based society in which our goals are more public, to provide public space, public library, sense of place, the World Wide Web, and so forth, where it becomes more based on information that we share rather than products we consume as individuals.
Excuse me, Tom. I'm feeling the pressure now. We have a few minutes left, and you remember we're going to try to have some wrap-up where each of you will have a couple minutes to kind of tell the audience and the here and abroad about whether you have a kind of an optimistic or a more pessimistic view about our ability to cope with the future or to intersect those trends that are so troubling to you all. But before we do that, this lady has been waiting a bit. I'm going to ask you to give your question, and then if it looks like it's going to require more answer than we have time, we'll try to weave it into the responses to the panelists.
Okay, thank you very much. As I've listened to the various comments of the panelists and the responses, I have heard, for the most part, what I would identify as a primarily utilitarian and certainly a humanist perspective on this. Dr. Sagoff said in his comments that one of the four things he thinks is a requirement is a change in our moral perspective on the environment to recognize the intrinsic value of nature. I'd like to ask the rest of the panelists, how important do you think a change in our moral perspective is in our ability to save, if you will, our environment?
Please go ahead. We have time to respond.
I'll go very quickly. I had hoped that, utilitarian is an epithet I've seldom had hurled at me. I don't know quite how to respond. I feel muddy and dirty. I agree with Mark entirely that clearly, that any kind of transformation, any kind of positioning of ourselves to face the future requires, in fact, a moral transformation in some of the ways that have actually been discussed more generally, I think, on the panel, away from the consumer kind of cultural orientation that Eugene just brought up and Mark did too, and toward some valuation of good that certainly transcends, the atomized individual. I regard myself, and I regard some of my comments earlier to be, in fact, a reminding of us that we need to consider other than instrumental and utilitarian ends.
Okay, jump in?
I would suggest also that I think that when you say a change, I think that many traditional societies, and certainly I've worked with rural people for many, many years, over 30, 40 years, and they do have a moral approach to the environment. I think when we become more urbanized and are living in the built environment, we have a little difficult time framing how we should approach nature. It's not as clear to us.
I also react to the notion of being called utilitarian. I've been called like a pantheist and a druid, and I guess I've been hiding it too well. So, but I think that this the next ethos, whatever succeeds the consumer society, will be deeply embedded in nature and an understanding of its workings, and that it'll actually possibly even come out of it.
I'm going to differ from my fellow panelists and defend the utilitarian point of view, if you like.
Now we can.
And I'm going to do it by telling a little story. I used to drive my car downtown to work. I knew I shouldn't, but I worked for an environmental organization and all like that, but I did. Until the price of parking in my part of Washington, D.C. went up to $10 a day. All of a sudden, I take the bus and the subway, right? I think sometimes we need economic incentives to help us deal with what we know we ought to do anyway. And I'll give you another example. Every community practically in the U.S. is struggling with solid waste problems. In Seattle some years ago, and now in quite a few places, they said, okay, the first bag of garbage a week is free. After that, it's $10 a bag. Guess what? The amount of garbage Seattle had to deal with was cut in half within a year. And they didn't have to open a new landfill, which was hotly controversial and so on. So my point is that particularly in urban, industrialized, modern societies, which is where we're headed worldwide to some degree, these kind of things are very important at reinforcing our moral and ethical stances as well. And so it's important to get the signals right. It's important to have incentives and tax structures and other utilitarian, regulations and things like that, that in fact provide incentives for people to do what they think they ought to do. Because none of us, frankly, is perfect, right?
I guess most will concede that point to you. Yeah? Why don't we take one more question here, and we'll try to give you a response.
Thank you very much. There seems to be a consensus among the panel about the idea of limits and our need to live within those. I work in agriculture, and I would caution us to be aware of the limits in terms of producing food as well. And I am very interested in having the panel respond to or comment on the issue of the use of genetic engineering in improving our ability to produce food for the large population that we're going to be experiencing.
I think the genetic engineering is going to have an absolutely profound impact on the farming sector, leading perhaps to the vertical integration of farms into the industries that also process and sell food. It's going to be an industrial system where the kinds of seeds that are used, it's very much like we grow chickens today, where it's really a huge corporate structure that in which the farmer is simply a worker or a laborer. Insofar as we're interested in increasing yields to serve a major population, and insofar as these technologies are available, we may see the thorough industrialization of the farming sector, and therefore a loss of the connection between farms and nature that seems to be fundamental to our image of ourselves as a society, as a culture, and not only us, other nations as well.
Mark, with your kind of premise that technology will advance and perhaps this type of technology will be especially prominent, how does this intersect with your values about nature and respecting it? In other words, are you opposed to the confinement of animals, for example, or to chicken factories, or to other kinds of processes which essentially take a biological reality and convert it into a kind of a production machine?
Plainly, you have to be, or I have to be, deeply ambivalent or divided. Insofar as we're able to increase yields this way, then we can spare more land for nature. How do you feel about that? If we limit technology in agriculture, we're going to have to take more land away from nature, but we can treat nature within the farm with more respect. I don't have an answer to that, but I certainly do feel the tension.
Anyone else wish to comment on this, or shall we? I have another question here. This one is from New Haven, Connecticut, and this may be our last question. I'll try to get yours in if we can. This one, as I say, comes from Connecticut. It says, in terms of international competition, will the United States be stronger or weaker in the year 2050 with respect to energy production and financial backing for energy production?
I haven't got a clue.
Yeah.
I'll venture a guess, if you'll accept it as just a guess. By 2050, unless we shift away from fossil fuels, we'll have used up a large share of the Earth's oil. And natural gas will be already on the downtrend, although there'll still be plenty of it around. In the U.S., we already went over that maximum in terms of our native production about 10 years ago. So the U.S. will be largely dependent on importing its energy if we are, except for coal, if we are still using fossil fuels. If, on the other hand, we've switched to a solar kind of technology, then we might be among the most secure and independent if we can compete well and lead that technology. So it depends very much, I think, on what choices we make. And so we have to ask, do we let large companies sort of guide us there, or do we say what we want as a society, which kind of future we'd rather have? And if we can articulate clearly which kind of future we'd rather have, then we probably can achieve that.
Thank you. Now, would you be willing just to kind of state your question and allow us to consider it as we respond? Mm-hmm. Thank you. Please come ahead then.
I've read that Cuba has had a lot of success with converting from petroleum-based farming to organic or semi-organic, since they don't have access to as much oil. And I'm wondering if any of you know anything about what's happening there, or if you can speak to their success.
Apparently no one is particularly familiar with that. Okay. Well, what I'd like to do now is to offer each of the panelists a couple of minutes to reflect on their own comments, on their work, and also on what the other panelists may have introduced to their thinking, and tell the audience about how they look at the future in terms of, is there hope, am I optimistic, or am I mostly pessimistic? But within that framework, give us some feel for it. And Mark, if you don't mind, since I started the other way in the speech, would you mind starting off?
Oh, sure. Thank you. I think that there are probably two. As a philosopher, I'm always making distinctions, so I'll draw two since there are 2 minutes. The first would have to do with what we do as individuals, particularly as individual consumers, and what we do together as members of organizations, associations, and of course political associations and governments. Too much we have thought that the government is here and our political and social organization to serve our interests or whims or desires or preferences as individual consumers. I think that in fact we have to reverse our emphasis and think of ourselves as setting goals together that we could not pursue or even prefer alone. And then I'll turn to the to a second, which is the difference between, a second distinction, which is the difference between ends and means to ends. Al Hammond quite rightly said that incentives are important, but important for what? Incentives are important in order to organize ourselves to meet certain goals. In order to prepare for the future, I think we ought to think about where we want to be, what goals we want to achieve. I'm sure that the answer that we at present get from economics, that we want to consume more and more, is not an answer anyone on this panel or anyone in this room or anyone in the audience would accept. I think we have to move away, therefore, from the language of economics and consider more our other moral and cultural and even religious foundations in seeking the goals that might guide us in forming policies, for which then we will use economics to provide the incentives.
Thank you, Mark. Tom?
Well, let's see. When we talked about the question before, we sort of phrased it in terms of an evaluative kind of stance. Do you feel optimistic about the future, or about the possibilities for the future, for humanity in the future, the quality of life, et cetera? And my first reaction to that was, obviously it's sort of, are you an optimist or a pessimist? It's that kind of a question. And I think that anybody who gets engaged ultimately in any kind of critique, whether or not it's a very heavy two-barreled kind of critique or a critique that focuses on very narrow and problem-solving kinds of things, is inherently optimistic about the future, or at least about the possibilities of the future. We all up here have to be optimists, I think, or why talk? Why not go out and take advantage of the possibility of furthering our ends in the consumerist society that we've condemned? I think that my optimism is, of course, tempered. It's an optimism of possibility, and that's why I'm involved in the game. That is, I take it very seriously that ideas can change behaviors, very much as Al was saying, certainly as Mark was saying. Al said if we had a collective kind of transformation, we could do a dramatic change in our relationship in the environment. And I sort of see the problem as not looking at, well, I find myself agreeing and then sort of distancing myself from what Mark just said, in that when he said goals, what kinds of goals do you want and the like, I thought, okay, I can agree with that if it's caveated or put down to a very specific and definitional kind of sense. In that, I think the question is, what kind of person do you want to be? What kind of person do you want your family or your descendants to be? What kind of people? Because the nature of the person is ineluctably joined with the kind of system that that person is a member of. That system includes a cultural system and a moral system and an ecological system. My colleague, whose seat I actually occupy right now, Roy Rappaport, who couldn't make it here, talks about the idea of a systemic future that can be considered healthy. He talks about maladaptive systems. And some of the things we've been talking about here as sort of long-term trends, scary trends, the kinds of vertical integration and the like, are exactly the kind of centralization and systemic disorder that he found most scary about the future, and I think that we have to actually fight against.
Tom. Mary?
Well, I, of course, would argue for inclusiveness, particularly in the discourse on environmental issues, because when you include those people who have traditionally not been included in the discourse, you change the nature of the discourse by introducing new concerns, by introducing new perspectives on things, by introducing new solutions. I know I have been living in northeast Wyoming, and there is a big push to bring the ranchers together with the people from, for example, Nature Conservancy. It's the only way that we can begin to hear from everyone. Once again, I talk about women who have had basically around the world to rely on informal power structures, but they have had a very deep and abiding interest in environmental issues at a local grassroots level, primarily, but not solely, because they interact on a daily basis with children and are concerned for their welfare and their family's welfare. In Austria, for example, you have Mothers Against Nuclear Power. In Poland, the women were organizing against heavy metals in drinking water because of concern for their family. There's a wonderful woman in rural Oklahoma who is a Cherokee, Jessie Deerenwater, who also came out strongly against nuclear waste in her part of the world. So I think that I am optimistic about those grassroots movements, because we at the grassroots know best the kind of priorities that we need to set as far as our environment goes.
Am I optimistic or pessimistic? I think, well, even with full access to family planning, my wife and I just had a baby, so you could say I'm optimistic. On the other hand, I think that instability and stability will be difficult to avoid. I think what I look at, what are the things that are the hardest to change? Increase in population, hardest to change without some form of instability. Increase in population, the loss of biodiversity in wildlands around the world. Things like that are long wavelength phenomenon, and they carry with them certain repercussions, as does the integration of global markets. And all of these transitions that we'll have to make, I think, will inevitably involve some form of upheaval, and we, rather than sort of say that we can avoid it, we should probably start thinking about what kinds of upheaval are likely and how we might best prepare for them, because I don't think it's necessarily bad. That being said, I think that we are in the middle of very rapid value change around the world. And one thing that I've paid heed to, if you look at polling data in the United States, for instance, we spend, what, 1 to 3% of our GNP on environmental remediation. Now, classical economists would say that's a drag on consumption. We define well-being as consumption, therefore it's a drag on human well-being, therefore voters will support getting rid of environmental remediation in order to increase their consumption and their well-being. Well, maybe economists are wrong about how voters and Americans think about their well-being. Maybe they do not see those expenditures as a drag on their well-being. Maybe they see them as part of an emerging value. that environment is important to them. And I think that's a rather profound and interesting change that stopped a lot of the anti-environmental aspects of the contract with America in its tracks in 95 and 96. And that's cause for hope, as is rapid change around the world about ideal family size. So I think there's cause for both optimism and pessimism, but what I do think is that we should pay heed to this basic fundamental characters of life, is what will life be like in the coming decades, and I do think we should prepare for instability.
I can't help, but I guess this would be a plug on commercial TV. Once more, I'd like to remind the audience that if you would like to see Eugene and some of his colleagues in a kind of a debate format with people who do not share all of their views, tune in tomorrow night on PBS for this debate entitled "Resolve the Environment. Environmentalists have gone too far, too fast." You can maybe find some of the subtleties that lie behind his brief concluding comments.
Okay. Well, I guess my message is that we have to be clear-eyed about the future. And if we are, that the trends that are now in place are really not totally optimistic. There are real problems ahead, and I've tried to suggest some of those. But personally, I'm fundamentally optimistic because we do know what to do to solve most of these problems. So I want to underscore what I said before, which is that trends are not destiny. But if we don't do something about them, they may become not our destiny, but our grandchildren's. And I don't think any of us would really want to see our children living in a world in which rich contended against poor violently, in which the earth was really impoverished and we had squandered a genetic inheritance that took 4 billion years to create. A number of those kinds of things. In a world that in fact was committed to centuries of very much more unstable climate, right? So as people become more aware, and exactly how Mary said, as citizens groups organize, as grassroots communities begin to take more control over their own destinies, there is in fact a big movement underway that is making changes right as we speak. Interestingly, the same thing's starting to happen at an international level. And we don't have a global government. We may never have a global government, but that we do need some kind of global governance because we're, in effect, running a planet and a global economy. So how do we govern that? How do we make some of these changes we're talking about? How do we get them into the political and economic system? Well, what's beginning to happen increasingly is the parallel at the international level with that community action. Non-governmental groups and some enlightened corporations are beginning to work together to nudge governments to deal with things like climate change, to ban landmines, to make progress on some of these other problems. And interestingly enough, technology is playing an important role because it is things like email that are empowering these groups to work together and to change values and to debate and so on, and to gang up, if you like, on governments and begin to push them into the right direction. So I think that there are many reasons for optimism, but it's not a passive optimism. It's an optimism that's conditioned on continuing to work towards making these kind of changes and that point us more in a direction that we'd like to go than the one that, in fact, we're headed in at the moment.
Let me just take a minute then. You know, the thing that strikes me is that many people who present data and information on global trends, food supply, population increase, number of pounds of waste disposed and all of this, are often called doomsdayers. Right? I mean, that's a common put down. But you yourself, although you array an awful threatening set of data, feel that there is time, that with the various forms of leverage like taxes you've emphasized, that you can use policy tools to speed up the process of response and avoid that specter of the numbers.
Yes, and in fact I think the policy tools are part of it, but they have to in effect follow what Mark was talking about. They have to follow a change in our consciousness and in effect a reassertion of what our goals are. Right, our basic values. We have to, in fact, for the first time in human history, we have to decide what kind of future we want. Because otherwise it's likely to happen in ways that we won't, frankly, really like, or indeed will be ashamed to admit to our grandchildren that we didn't do something about.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I'd just like to give one example of how values can affect larger economic behavior. You take what happened with tuna when there were revelations about catching tuna with nets off the Latin American coast, led to a killing of thousands of dolphins. Well, what happened was environmentalists organized grassroots opposition to this, and Tony O'Reilly and Heinz took action before any legislation to ban the capturing of killing of tuna with that method, and then legislation followed. It was a case in which it mobilized public opinion. Now, you know, it's hard to mobilize opinion for the snail darter, but as it is for a dolphin. But as this ethos becomes generalized, it'll have an effect on consumer decisions, and that'll in turn have an effect on policy. And I think I agree with Mary that that's what's going to drive change.
I noticed that when we took our brief break, that a number of the people in the hallway that talked to me were talking about the civic possibility, about non-governmental organizations and other sources of energy that have traditionally been discounted are going to be much more influential in shaping attitudes, shaping ethical responses, and of course, values. Well, we're about to come to the end of the time that we're allotted for television. I would like to tell the audience once again, if you'd like to continue this discussion by getting on the listserv, I'll give you that number again. I'm not sure how many of the panelists will be able to respond, but some of them have indicated their willingness to participate. That listserv number, once again, is listserv@listserv.vt.edu. So with that, and first of all, thanks to all of you. I hope the audience enjoyed your contributions and your discussion as much as I did. And I'd like to say to everyone now, thank the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities and Public Policy for their support of this program, and all of you who are listening and all of you who are in the audience for your participation and support. So for the Choices and Challenges Project from Virginia Tech, thank you. Good afternoon.
The Choices and Challenges series is a production of the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg, Virginia. For the tape or a printed transcript of this program, or to receive assistance in planning community programs based on this teleconference, contact Choices and Challenges Project, 156 Lane Hall, Virginia Tech, Blacksburg, Virginia, 24061-0227, or call 540-231-6476. or email choices@vt.edu. Visit our website at www.cis.vt.edu/choices and challenges.